Hello, welcome to this DCS A-18C tutorial. In this video, we will be covering your primary tool for air-to-ground attack, and that is the ATFLIR targeting pod. So to begin, let's open our rearm window. Of course, select your preferred livery and loadout. For this example, I will just be bringing up the targeting pod. So we'll go to Station 4, Pods, ATFLIR. You'll see the FA-18C can utilize two different targeting pods. The Lightning is older technology and is not as integrated with your plane. It's a bit more complex and cumbersome to use, so we'll cover that in a later tutorial video. For now, we're going to focus on the ATFLIR, as that's the most integrated with your plane and probably the most useful. I'll throw on a fuel tank and hit OK.
Request refueling. Request rearming. Copy.
We're going to wait until we see the ATFLIR on our stores page. Menu, TAC menu, stores.
Refueling complete.
All right, we got the refueling complete. Now they'll do the rearming.
Flight controls. Flight controls.
Rearming complete.
Alrighty, our rearming is complete, and now we can see the ATFLIR on our number 4 station. On our plane, we can see it right here on our left cheek. After we have it on our plane, we can go to this bottom display, the menu. And on this right-hand side, we will see a FLIR switch. We will want to put this to standby. Once it is in standby, we are now warming up and aligning our targeting pod, and you will see a new option on our TAC menu called FLIR. You can go ahead and click that. Now you will see it says not timed out and ready RDY has a line through it. This means our targeting pod is still warming up. You can integrate this warm-ups procedure into your startup. Just wait until you actually have it on your plane before you switch this switch into the standby position. Now it'll take a minute or two. We could fly out, head over to the target, and it'll still be warming up. And that's what I'll do now. And when it gets done warming up, I'll point out how the symbology changes and what we can do after that. So right now, not timed out, ready with a line through it, it's warming up. All right, we're going to head over to this practice field we have set up to the south to demonstrate how to acquire targets with your pod. All right, the pod is finished warming up. I'll cover that in more detail once we're heading over to the area. Alrighty, so now you can see the not timed out went away. The ready with a line through it has also disappeared, and we now see standby. That means, along with this other symbology, that the targeting pod is warmed up and is aligned. So we can come back to our FLIR switch and move it to the to the on position with a right click. Right click is up, left click is down. If you put it back into the off position accidentally, you need to put it back to standby and wait for the warm up to start over again. Alright, now our FLIR is on, and we see in the upper left OPR to show it as operational. To activate our pod, we'll go into air to ground, arm the plane, make the targeting pod our sensor of interest with sensor control switch down so we see the diamond, and double tap our nose wheel steering button. You will now see VVSLV is boxed. That means velocity vector slaved. So we'll see our velocity vector in the center of the pod, and that means that our pod is looking wherever our velocity vector is pointing. We double tap nose wheel steering again, we will see the symbology change. We will cover this in more detail in a future video. For now, just know if you ever need to reset your pod, we will get it into the velocity vector slave mode by double tapping our nose wheel steering button. Double tap it again, it changes the display. Double tap nose wheel steering, velocity vector slave is boxed, and we see our velocity vector. This is going to be our starting position for all of our targeting pod operation. Alrighty, so I'll cover some information on here, and then we'll start working on selecting some targets down there. On our targeting pod, we see WFOV in the upper left. This indicates our zoom level. So if I used my radar altitude control that we used in the A-to-A tutorials to change our radar scan altitude, you will see it changes to M field of view for medium field of view. Do it again. Now it is M field of view 2.0. I'll go back. M field of view 1.0. So 1 times, 2 times zoom. I can do it again, and now I'm in a near field of view. And then 2 times near. I'll go back all the way out to wide. On the top, we will see TV. If we click this button, it now changes to IR for a heat sensing mode. This is generally what we'll want to be in, but you can experiment and see what you prefer in different situations. On the right hand side, you will see a UFC option with an LST number code LTDR. We will cover this in more detail in a laser guiding video. Down here, you will see an LST. We will also cover that in more detail in a laser guided bombing video. If you wish to change the brightness and the contrast of your display, we will come up to this left-hand corner rocker switch and click Night to put this display into night mode. If we are in night mode, we can utilize this left rocker and this right rocker to adjust the gain and the contrast of our pod display to better be able to acquire targets. Here, once again, we have our horizon line, our velocity vector, and an arrow indicating the northward direction. So north is somewhere over here. We also have coordinates of where our targeting pod is looking. And grids if you prefer to use those. So because our targeting pod is velocity vector slaved, It is looking wherever our velocity vector is out on the HUD. If you have waypoints set, you'll be able to see them. Here we can see waypoint 5 is out here. That will come into play in a few minutes when I show you how to utilize waypoints for your targeting pod. Alright, things are looking a little dark out there, so I'm going to adjust the gain and the contrast to make it a little easier to see using these rocker switches on the side. Alrighty, that's looking good. We can see we are in white hot mode for the IR. If we wanted to go to black hot, we could click the white hot button and we'll be in black hot. We'll go back to white hot for now. So the first and probably easiest method to lock your targeting pod to a location on the ground while you are in velocity vector slave mode and your targeting pod is your sensor of interest, all we need to do is put the velocity vector over where we want our targeting pod to look and press our TDC depress. So if I put my velocity vector about here, where I see those targets out there, I will hit TDC depress, and now you will see a diamond where that velocity vector was, and that's showing our targeting pod is now locked at that location. I will go ahead and adjust the contrast to my liking and zoom in. You can move your targeting pod where it's looking with your throttle designator controller. We can see there are some targets down there. These little white hot spots. When we have a target and a diamond selected on our targeting pod display, we are able to see the diamond in our HUD similar to the air-to-air symbology tutorial video. We have a line, a degree, and a flashing diamond. That means our targeting pod is looking in this direction, this many degrees, and it's flashing because our helmet cannot see it. So if I move my helmet, you can see the helmet diamond becomes solid when we have view of it. I'll turn around so it's a little easier to see. Additionally, the screen has turned dark because even though our targeting pod is still programmed to be looking at that area, it is being blocked by our plane, or it just cannot rotate itself in order to see the target we have selected. Alright, our targeting pod is starting to be able to rotate itself. Right now you can see it's being blocked by our plane. So if I level out, it's not being blocked. If I move, you can see our plane is blocking it. Alrighty, to make things easier, let's go ahead and set up an orbit. In order to do that, we will activate our barometric altitude hold, our attitude hold on the bank for the turn angle we want, and I'll throttle back and throw on my auto throttle control with T, as discussed in a previous video. And now my plane is essentially locked in this orbit around this area. So once again, in our helmet, we see the degrees offset, the arrow, and the diamond. So if I follow that arrow towards the flashing diamond, the diamond becomes solid, and I now know where my targeting pod is looking. If I move off, the diamond starts to flash. On our targeting pod display, we will now see a line and a number in meters. That means this line signifies this many meters. This is useful for ranging or gauging the length of targets or distance between targets. So I can see this line signifies about 58 meters. These lines going around the side here indicate where our targeting pod will be looking on the next zoom level. So right now I'm on medium field of view. If I zoom in, it is now encompassing the area of these lines. So every zoom level will go in to this section. Now I'll go into this section, now this, and so on. And you'll see the scale on the line here changes every time. So I know from here to here is about 7 meters. On the side, we will have a distance from us to our target diamond. And the amount of degrees off our nose it is. So in addition to having it in the helmet here, we will see the angle of our targeting pod, how it's looking. So it's looking 115 degrees to our left and increasing because now we're going around the target. Alrighty, to get out, I will double tap nose wheel steering. You see it is in the symbology we do not want. Double tap nose wheel steering again, and it's back in velocity vector slaved to our velocity vector. I'm going to come out of the orbit and turn around and demonstrate acquiring a target with their velocity vector once again. So with our targeting pod as sensor of interest, with the diamond in the upper right hand corner, we'll put our velocity vector over where we want our targeting pod to look and press TDC depress. Now we have a diamond there, and our targeting pod is looking wherever we just pressed our button. We can slew it around with our throttle designator controller and zoom in with the same control we used to change our radar altimeter scan height in air-to-air mode. Pretty simple. I'll go ahead and get back out into the reset base mode, velocity vector slaved, double tapping nose wheel steering until you see this symbology. And now the next and probably most useful method to lock up a target is to utilize your helmet. While you're in air to ground, you're armed, your pod is all set up. Instead of having our sensor of interest on our targeting pod with the diamond, we can press sensor control switch up to make our helmet our sensor of interest. You'll see how the symbology changes. I'll do that again. So targeting pod, sensor of interest with the diamond. We do not see anything in the center of our helmet. If we press sensor control switch up, we now see a dashed circle, tick circle, with a dot in the center. This indicates our helmet is now our sensor of interest. In order to mark a target for our targeting pod to look at, all we need to do is put this dot over what we want our targeting pod to look at and press our TDC depress. Let's go ahead and try that now. So we have some friendly units down here. I'm going to put the dot over the units and hit TDC depress. That's close enough, and then I can walk it in on the pod itself. After you TDC depress, make sure you make your targeting pod your sensor of interest once again. So sensor control switch down. Alright, I can see these units. They're a bit hard to see. So once again, I will adjust my gain and contrast to my liking. And same as before, we can slew the targeting pod around with our TDC. Alright, I'm going to reset, double tap my nose wheel steering, double tap it again. I'm back in velocity vector slave mode. I will go sensor control switch up to make my helmet my sensor of interest. And let's go look for some of those enemy ground vehicles where we practiced earlier. Alright, it looks like there's some targets out here. So I'm going to put my helmet over where I think a target is, or in a general area, TDC depress, and then utilize my targeting pod to walk it in. So targeting pod, sensor of interest once again, and I can see these targets. Remember, if the picture is hard to read, if you're in night mode, utilizing this rocker, you can adjust your gain and contrast with these side rockers. I will go ahead and reset my targeting pod once again. Back to velocity vector slave mode. Remember, your reset is double tapping your nose wheel steering button to cycle between these two modes, and you want velocity vector slave to be boxed. Another method of slewing your targeting pod to a desired location is utilizing a waypoint. As you saw earlier, I had pre-programmed a waypoint in this area in the same method as in our navigation tutorial. In my case, it is waypoint 5. In order to slew our targeting pod to waypoint 5, we will be on our SA page, Situational Awareness, and we will press WPDSG, Weapon Designate. That has now slaved our targeting pod to waypoint 5. I'll turn around so you can see that. We were in velocity vector slave. I hit weapon designate. We now have target boxed, showing we have a target. And it is on waypoint 5, indicated by that upside down triangle and the number 5. If you utilize a weapon designate marking function, you will not be able to slew your targeting pod around off the waypoint. In order to slew it off the waypoint, we will need to press and hold TDC depress, then we can move it, and then we can release it. You will see that sometimes our targeting pod will start to move on its own. In order to stop that, we will press sensor control switch in the direction of our targeting pod display. In this case, sensor control switch down because our targeting pod is on the bottom screen. And we will do that until we get back to the diamond. I'll do that one more time. So we can go back to velocity vector slave mode, weapon designate, waypoint 5, the picture is a little darker because we're further away, so I will adjust the contrast. And right now, our Targeting pod is locked on waypoint 5. If I'm moving my TDC, it will not move off of the weapon designated point. In order to move it, I will press and hold TDC depress, move it. It starts to move, so I will sensor control switch down until I get back to the diamond. You will notice if you press your sensor control switch in the direction of the display, in this case down, the diamond changes symbology. In this case, we have a box-looking symbology and then 2 vertical lines. We will cover those in greater detail in the applicable tutorials. Just remember, you always want it in the diamond for everything we're doing so far. Sensor control switch down in the direction of the display, down because it's on the bottom here, to change these modes back to the diamond. The waypoint method is useful if you want to get a targeting pod in a certain general area before you get to a target, rather than having to search it out with your helmet. But I find that 90% of the time I'll just be utilizing my helmet. One final note, on your essay page, you will be able to see where your targeting pod is looking in relation to you by this symbol here. You'll see it starts to slew around depending on how I move my TDC and where I make the targeting pod look. As you practice utilizing the targeting pod to acquire targets, keep in mind that the further you are zoomed in, the slower it will slew. So if I'm zoomed in all the way, it's going to slew slowly. You can see it moving very slowly in my helmet. I'll zoom in. But if I zoom out, it will slew faster. The power of this targeting pod comes in its speed in acquiring targets. So I will demonstrate that back on those targets from earlier. You will use a wide zoom to locate the general area of the target, zoom in for detail, drop your weapon, mark the target, what have you, zoom out, slew to the next target because it is faster, zoom in, mark, drop the weapon, what have you. Alright, I will go back to velocity vector slave mode to reset. Sensor control switch up to make my helmet the sensor of interest. Put it in the general area of the targets and TDC depress. Sensor control switch back down to control our targeting pod. And I will zoom out to look for the targets, adjusting my contrast and brightness to my liking. I see a white spot here, so I know that's probably a target. I'll move my cursor over it, zoom in, and that's a vehicle. I'll zoom out. I see a white spot up here. I'm going to slew to it, zoom in. That's a vehicle. Zoom out, white spot here, slew to it, zoom in. That is not a vehicle. So you can play with different zoom levels to your comfortability and liking to find targets. That covers all of the targeting pod basics. In the next video, we will cover how to utilize your targeting pod to drop some bombs. Thanks for watching.